listener production.
Hello, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. You might have heard about the GDP figures being released yesterday and how they showed Australia's had its worst economic growth since the 90s. Whenever there's big economic news, it's usually filled with jargon and technical words that don't really mean much to most people. So today, we're bringing you a straightforward explainer on what's going on in the Aussie economy right now and how it affects you.
The RBA is trying to, as I said before, slow the economy to get rid of inflation. They literally are trying to do that. Are they trying to smash the economy? No, of course not. Is the economy even genuinely smashed? No, we're still growing.
We'll get to that in the second half of this episode. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Bension Siebert. It is Thursday, the 5th of September.
Good morning, Sasha. Well, it's been another massive day at the Paralympics for our Aussie athletes, taking home an incredible 9 medals. 5 of those came in the para road cycling with 3 silver medals and 2 bronze. Lauren Parker claimed second place in the H13 individual time trial, making her Australia's first dual sport medal winner at the Paralympics in 44 years. She also won gold in the para triathlon on Monday, Sasha.
Yeah, and heading to the pool, Alexa Leary broke 2 world records in a single day to claim gold in the women's 100-metre freestyle S9, and here she is speaking to Nine following that race.
It's been a long, rough journey for me, but it's a miracle that I'm living and I'm walking and I'm talking. When they were told that I never would 3 years ago, and I've just come so far. I am so impressed with myself. I'm like, Lex, look how far you've actually come.
Yeah, Alexa has such an amazing story. So cool to see her claim her second gold. And we did also nab 2 other bronze medals in the pool and another gold medal in the women's table tennis with Kwon Yang.
Over to the US now, where there's been another deadly school shooting. 4 people have been killed, with 9 others injured and taken to hospital after a shooter opened fire at Appalachia High School in Georgia. Authorities say a suspect is alive and in custody. CNN reports that a law enforcement source said the suspect is believed to be a 14-year-old boy. That has not been officially confirmed. US President Joe Biden released a statement saying he's mourning the deaths, which he said were caused by senseless gun violence. He said the US cannot continue to accept this as normal. A vigil to remember the victims is being organised, and the local community is trying to process the horror of what happened.
A new report is revealing just how bad the gambling picture is in Australia right now as the federal government continues to face pressure to ban ads for it. The Grattan Institute has released its Better Bet, How Australia Should Prevent Gambling Harm paper, which has found Australians are losing the most amount of cash to gambling in the world. The average person is down $1,600 a year, mostly through pokies and betting, a total of $24 billion in the 2020-21 financial year, which is the last round of data we have on this. The report also found pokie machines are more common in Aussie suburbs than public toilets, ATMs, and post boxes. So what the paper's recommending is completely banning gambling ads, reducing the number of pokie machines around the country, and also bringing in a mandatory pre-commitment loss limit for online gambling and poker machines, Bension.
Yeah, and the Labor government has backed away from a total ban, despite calls from the crossbench and some of its own MPs to go harder. Instead, it's taken a partial ban approach to Parliament, which would see gambling ads banned online, in children's programming, during and for an hour each side of live sport broadcasts, and limited to 2 an hour in general programming. Bans on ads in stadiums and on player gear are also under consideration, Sasha.
Yeah, and something else that this report highlighted, which I thought was worth touching on, was how pokies are more prevalent in lower socioeconomic suburbs and how residents in these areas are spending more money on pokies even than the state average, which is already really high. So one example is Fairfield, which is in Sydney's southwest. Residents there lose on average $3,967 a year on pokies. In Victoria, there are 2 main communities that stand out, Brimbank and Dandenong, and they've led the the state in pokies losses per person for at least a decade, while the Northern Territory had the highest average gambling losses of any state or territory in the 2020-21 figures, which was at 2,169. So we can see where this number jumps up quite significantly when it's in areas and suburbs and states that have more disadvantaged communities. So it's a real concern. And I think the approach to limit pokies as well is a good suggestion by the Grattan Institute. It's something that hasn't really been talked about by any of the politicians in terms of, well, how about we take some pokies out of suburbs and see if that makes a difference. So we'll see. We'll see if the federal government takes any of this report and implements its recommendations.
And our favourite B-girl, Rachel Raygun Gunn, has broken her silence overnight, speaking for the first time since her viral Olympics performance. In a sit-down interview with The Project, she issued an apology to the breaking community.
I am very sorry for, the backlash that the community has experienced, but I can't control how people react.
She was also asked whether she thought she was our best female breakdancer. This was her response.
Well, I think my record speaks to that. I was the top-ranked Australian B-girl in 2020 and 2022 and 2023. I've been invited to represent at how many World Championships.
And just to note, that soundtrack is them, not us.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of a bit off-putting, isn't it? The 36-year-old uni professor also spoke about the wave of backlash she copped since becoming a global meme. She described it as still pretty hard to process. She says she got mental health support early and has gone off socials. She also said she hadn't actually watched her performance back. She touched on the Jimmy Fallon skit that was done where a comedian came out and pretended to be her. She also said that she has mixed emotions about that, but she kind of credited him with giving her more of a platform. Another interesting tidbit was that Raygun claimed Richard Branson called her afterwards and called her plucky and courageous and asked her to perform on some of his cruise ships with Boy George. So I think what people are upset about with this, in that she doesn't seem to accept maybe why people are so upset by this. And look, whether you are upset by this or not, this is what the discourse is. People are pissed that she got up there and appeared to make a mockery of breaking, and whether that's upset people in the community or upset regular Australians who are embarrassed that that was our representative. She is sticking to her guns, saying, I qualified, I did my best, and now look at me, now look at all these great deals I'm getting. So, look, I think that might be the end of Raygun and us talking about her on the briefing. I know a few listeners are kind of overhearing about her. My husband last night said, stop giving her airtime. So, that's what she's had to say, and all the best to her, and we wish her luck, don't we, Bension? Absolutely.
And I was just really interested to hear her in that interview talk about the fact that she knew she wasn't going to win when she was going into the Olympics, but that people don't understand the difference between like an artistic breaking style and an athletic breaking style, and she was obviously trying to go for the former. I do have some sort of empathy for this person who has been the center of this absolute massive global storm, and I completely understand going off social media and not watching anything back and not doing that. But I guess this is what happens when you're an Olympian representing your country. You have to accept all of the consequences that come with it.
Yeah, well said, Bension. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on Raygun and for being here for the headlines today. Next up, it is your deep dive. It's a no bullshit explainer on the economy and why we should care about it.
So yesterday, Australia's economy got its quarterly checkup, and the results are in. GDP grew by 1.5% over a year. But what does that actually mean? And how does GDP growth, or really any of the other jargony economics words we've been hearing in the news lately, actually affect our lives? Because hearing news about the Australian economy can be a bit like getting important results from the doctor. You sometimes have to wade through a thick mist of technical terms before you can understand the actual meaning. Well, we're here to clear the mist, and the Motley Fool's Chief Investment Officer, Scott Phillips, is here to help us. Scott, welcome back to the briefing.
Bension, thank you. Good to be with you.
The GDP figure has been all over the news. In 30 seconds, can you explain what is GDP? Why should we care about it?
I love it, mate. Great question. GDP, gross domestic product. Some economists about 70 years ago said, how do we work out how big the economy is? How do we work out if it's growing or declining? And the answer was, let's add up all of the things that we do, all the services. So think about hairdressers and physios and bankers, and add up all the things we make. Think about, the things we produce and do, the houses we build, the machines we build, the things we do in the economy that exports, like wheat, for example, or iron ore. Add all that together and give that a value. Now, gross being total, domestic, obviously being Australia as opposed to international, and then product, again, we now call goods and services. So that combination is the total size of the Australian economy. Now, it's an approximation. The ABS doesn't ask every single one of us, but they work out roughly what that looks like, and they compare that against previous periods to work out whether the economy is growing or getting smaller.
So, yesterday we heard that the GDP grew by 1.5% over a year. Is that bad? Is that good? Medium?
That's a really good question. Yes, is the answer to all of those things. So, look, we want the economy probably to grow about 2 to 3% per year. Now, you might say, why not more? We know what happens when things get too overexcited, right? We're actually living through that period right now. Think about inflation and rates. If an economy overheats, grows too strongly, it creates problems. If it doesn't go strongly enough, then we end up having, frankly, we get poorer. And as a society, we want to grow at a modestly consistent rate. It also helps to do things like start businesses or allocate resources, right? If you've got lots of bumpy volatility, you don't know whether you can kind of invest, whether you can start a business, whether you can take a job. So we want it to be about 2 to 3%, give or take. The result at 1.5% over the year is frankly better than I had feared, but worse than I had hoped. 0.2% again for the quarter, for the third quarter in a row. I mean, honestly, again, I mentioned it's an estimation. If you're growing at 0.2, it's possible we're actually going backwards by just a touch, or growing a little bit faster than that because of the sampling error, right? The ABS doesn't ask everybody. So hopefully it's a good thing, but we are bumping along the bottom. The bad news, mate, the really bad news, I think, of all of this is the GDP per capita. Now, per capita is a Latin phrase that economists like to use to sound smart. It just means per person, right? So we take the total output of the economy, divide it by the number of us and say, do we, the pie's a little bit bigger, 1.5% bigger, as you said. Are we getting larger slices, or are there simply more slices? And the bad news is that GDP per person is going backwards. So the pie's getting a little bit bigger, the average slice is getting a little bit smaller, and that's been the case now for about, I think it's now 7 quarters in a row, almost 2 years of shrinking GDP per capita. That largely is because the population is growing really quickly, but economic growth is not keeping up.
We talk about the cost of living all the time. Rising cost of living equals inflation. At the most basic level, what is the relationship between GDP and inflation?
Oh, that's a good one too. There's no direct necessary linkage. But as I kind of mentioned before, the rate of growth of an economy, we think about supply and demand, right? Economics, we kind of pretend it's a science. It's not really, it's an art, right? It's a study of applied psychology, really. But the one bit of maths, one of the only laws in economics is supply and demand. For any given level of supply, if you have more demand, growing demand, if demand grows faster than supply, you're going to see upwards pressure on prices. Now think about houses. If you've got 5 houses in a street and there's 3 people that turn up to an auction and all 5 of them are for sale, they can pretty much pay bottom dollar, get the house they want, they're all sweet. For those same 10 houses, say 5 houses, I should say, 10 people want them, we know that there's going to be very, very heated bidding wars. Anyone who's tried to buy property in Australia in the last, well, frankly, probably 40 years, but certainly the last 3 or 4, knows exactly what that's like. So the GDP number in itself, if it's too hot, can be an indicator that we are going to see inflationary pressures. If it's lower, there's less chance of that inflationary outcome. And so when you ask for the relationship, there's not directly causal necessarily, but let's throw interest rates into the ring and make it a 3-sided triangle. What the RBA is trying to do is dampen down that demand so that we can see prices fall. A lower level of demand for a given level of supply should see less upward pressure on prices, i.e. less inflation, and that also should show through in GDP, the number of things we make. If there's not as much demand, businesses won't make quite as much stuff, the economy won't grow quite as quickly.
So we're at this point. We grew only 0.2% over the past 3 months. Should we be worried about a recession? And what does a recession mean to the average person?
Don't worry about a recession, but be mindful that at this really anemic level of quarterly growth, it's possible. I got to say, mate, I was really happy to see yesterday's numbers because between the retail sales that have been terrible, the Treasurer had done a full court press in the media to try and tell us about how bad things were going to be, but it wasn't his fault. There was an outside chance we had a negative GDP number. In other words, the economy contracted. It got smaller. 2 of those in a row, that's what we call a recession. If the economy contracts for 6 months, we say, yep, things are smaller. We have a recession. That is a problem. Now, in itself, it doesn't really cause anything. In fact, and by the way, these numbers we're talking about, yesterday's numbers, that's the June quarter. So it's more than 2 months ago, right? So we're looking backwards and saying, during that 3 months, April, May, June, did the economy grow or contract? I mean, we started in April. We're now talking in September. So 5 months ago is the data we're kind of looking at, and then 4 and 3 months ago, of course. So that's kind of, we're trying to ask ourselves, where was the economy at that point? And frankly, when you know you're in a recession, chances are, by the time you realise, you're probably already out of it because the economy's probably started to grow anyway. But what the real risk of recession, I said before, economics is basically applied psychology. Here's the thing. If you ask anybody, is recession bad? They'll say, yeah, of course it is. Terrible. We don't want that. So what happens? If you say to someone, we're in a recession, they go, oh, that's terrible. If I'm a consumer, I'll stop spending. If I'm a business, I won't hire. I won't buy the material, the equipment I need to run my business. I'll pull back just in case. And what does that contraction in spending do? It causes more declines in economic activity, makes the economy smaller. So it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The risk or the existence of a recession in itself is immaterial. If you didn't know about it, nothing would happen. But once we do know about it, once we fear what's coming next, it actually can make things worse because we know we're in one, ironically, than if we didn't know at all.
You mentioned the Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, talking about the economy and how it's not his fault if things are going badly. He said that the Reserve Bank's interest rate rises were smashing the Australian economy. Is that right?
He also blamed international forces. The language is unfortunate. So I sound like a politician. The language was dumb. Let me be clearer. I don't want to put words in his mouth, and I don't want to get myself in legal trouble. When you say something like the RBA is smashing the economy, you invite people to think those people at the RBA are bad. They should stop hurting me. Thankfully, we have this nice man who's in the Treasury office who's trying to help me. And that is, so other words, wrong? Yes. Is the sentiment wrong? Not directly, no. The RBA is trying to, as I said before, slow the economy to get rid of inflation. They literally are trying to do that. Are they trying to smash the economy? No, of course not. Is the economy even genuinely smashed? No, we're still growing. So it's some convenient political language, I think, and I'm not being partisan here. I would say the same if it was the shadow treasurer. What we know is that the RBA is trying to cool the economy down so they can deal with inflation. I very much would have preferred the treasurer say, dealing with inflation is a really, really important task. The RBA is doing its best. They have my full support. Otherwise, I won't comment on the RBA because we believe as a country, we know it's functionally independent. When you're verballing the RBA from the Treasurer's office, it's going to have the effect I suspect he wants to have, but also it means we're talking about it at a time when we probably should have said, look, the RBA is doing it. It's going to cause, we have 2 bad outcomes. We either have higher rates or higher inflation. We need to choose one of them. There's no door number 3. And by the way, food prices up 19.4% since January 2020. Right now, food prices are 20% higher. Think about that over 4.5 years. Would we have preferred a short recession to permanently higher food prices? Probably. The RBA's view is certainly that they're better off having lower economic growth for a while, maybe even risking a recession. They don't want to cause one, but they're prepared to risk one so that our living standards, we mentioned living standards before, it is that cost of living, right? If prices go up and stay high, our living standards are permanently damaged. And that's where we are right now. The longer that goes on, the more our living standards go backwards.
So 2 pretty bad options, recession, which we don't like, unemployment, that kind of thing, inflation, which we don't like, or higher cost of living, we don't like that either. So it's a pretty difficult dilemma.
Yep.
Scott Phillips, thanks so much for joining us again on The Briefing.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Scott Phillips there. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy this little explainer. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom and hit that subscribe button. We'll be back in your feed this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Speak to you soon.
Listener.